Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? The role of PPPs in infrastructure development.
My name is Tony Gomez-Ibanez, and I'm a fan of P3s in infrastructure. By P3, I mean public-private partnerships in infrastructure. But I'm concerned that these P3s be done in circumstances where they're both economically sensible and politically acceptable. And for me, the key is the motive for the privatization. That some motives generate controversy, while one motive, real efficiency gains, is the most sensible reason to do P3s. At the risk of oversimplification, there are three basic motives for P3s in infrastructure. The first, and the one that is discussed most often, is to tap private capital markets to finance badly needed investments in infrastructure. A second motive, which is often not acknowledged but is often important, is to transfer resources in a way such as to alleviate immediate budget problems of government. And the third motive is to incentivize real efficiency gains. What I mean by real efficiency gains is transformations that allow you to produce more reliable or better outputs for the same inputs. And they're distinct from transfers, which just involve the transfer of resources from one party to another without necessarily making their use more efficient. These three motives tend to be associated with three different types of privatizations, or P3s. The first is a concession to build, operate, maintain, and transfer a new facility, such as a new toll road or a new wastewater treatment plant. In the case of these types of P3s, the primary motive is to tap private capital markets to gain the funds needed for the investment, although efficiency gains and transfers may be involved as well. The second type of partnership is a lease for a fixed term or the outright sale of an existing facility, such as an existing toll road or existing port or railway or airline. Often these are called brownfield facilities or projects because they involve an existing facility, although the line between brownfield and greenfield is typically blurred because the brownfield project may require some improvements or investments. But the emphasis is usually not on investment, but rather on the transferring of a loss-making enterprise to private hands where it will be profitable, or the capitalization of the benefits of a profitable enterprise for current use. I argue that the first two motives for P3s, that is, tapping private capital markets or transferring resources to alleviate immediate budget problems, are problematic and can get you into trouble, and that the real reason for doing P3s is to incentivize real efficiency gains. Tapping private capital markets is problematic because the government can borrow from capital markets itself directly rather than having to borrow through the medium of a concessionaire. It's important to understand that partnerships are not a form of free finance, that the investors in a concession expect to be repaid just like the investors in a government bond expect to be repaid. Moreover, they both draw from the same sources of repayment, same basic sources, which is either taxpayer receipts or the charges levied on the users of the infrastructure. Moreover, government debt, borrowing from directly, is often cheaper than borrowing through a concessionaire. In the United States, for example, states can borrow at 5 to 6% interest rates, whereas investors in private infrastructure typically want a return of more in the 10 to 12% range. Now, this difference in borrowing rates is a little bit of an illusion because the taxpayer doesn't have any default risk if the borrowing is through the concessionaire, whereas he does have default risk if the borrowing is through the government. The second motive, transferring resources for the immediate relief of government budget problems, is also problematic. In developing countries, this usually takes the form of the lease or sale of a state-owned enterprise that is losing money because it has excess labor, or its tariffs are unrealistically low, or its services are more extensive than is really needed. And the basic idea is that the private concessionaire will shed labor, raise prices, prune the network of services, so as to restore profitability and alleviate the budget support that the government had to provide to the enterprise. In this case, the project essentially involves transfers from users who now have to pay more or labor which has to find a job, to taxpayers who no longer have to support the money-losing enterprise. In developed countries, it has taken the form of sale or lease of a profitable enterprise or facility, in return for an upfront payment from the concessionaire that can be used to meet immediate budget needs. In the United States, this is called asset monetization. In Australia, it's called asset recycling. But either way, the essential is that it's a transfer of resources from future taxpayers who no longer have the available profits from the enterprise to current taxpayers who enjoy the upfront payment and can use it for other purposes. But if partnerships are all about transfers, or only about transfers, then privatization becomes a zero-sum game in which one party gains and some other party loses. And zero-sum games are politically controversial. It's hard to build support for them. Real efficiency gains, on the other hand, are the only way that a project can become win-win and not zero-sum. So real efficiency gains are politically very important in a P3 project. Real efficiency gains come from several sources. The first of these, and often the most important, is that there's a single person or enterprise that's responsible for both the building and the maintenance and the operation of the facility. And that means that there's less finger pointing when something goes wrong. There's one person or one group that's held responsible. In particular, this often takes the form of life cycle perspective, so that the builder of the road or facility keeps in mind the problems of maintaining it. One dramatic example that I learned about recently was roads in the rainy area of Colombia, which typically wash out every rainy season. But when they're granted as a concession to build and operate them, the concessionaire has an incentive to build them in such a way that they don't have to be rebuilt every time the rain falls. A second source of efficiency gains is that you provide the concessionaire with more scope to decide how to produce the services themselves. In essence, you can think of it as they're contracting for a stream of services rather than a specific asset, and giving that flexibility gives them an opportunity to be more efficient. My favorite example is the Port of Miami Tunnel, which the public sector had estimated would cost it $1 billion to build. But when it went out as a P3, the concessionaire that won came in with a design that cost only $600 million to build. And he did that by changing the alignment of the tunnel slightly to avoid some difficulties. What was helpful was that the Port of Miami was buying not a specific asset, but a tunnel crossing, and that flexibility allowed them to explore more efficient methods and designs. In this light, greenfield concessions are more attractive than brownfield concessions, because in greenfield concessions there's more scope for efficiency gain, inasmuch as the concessionaire does the construction as well as the maintenance. But the real reason to use expensive private capital in concessions or in P3s is to motivate and incentivize these real efficiency gains. If the concessionaire has some skin in the game, then it's going to try hard to build a road that doesn't wash out in the rainy season, to build a tunnel that is cheaper and just as good. We may pay a little extra for that private capital, but without it, you wouldn't get the efficiency gains that are important. And wouldn't get the value that you hope for out of the private sector. In closing, I'd urge you to look for projects where there are real efficiency gains, where there are good reasons to believe that the private sector can do it cheaper or better or more reliably than traditional public procurement. And you should shy away from projects which involve mainly transfers, because they're going to be politically controversial and difficult to manage.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.